Colleen, thank you so much for joining me today, for How She Led to Me. I'm so excited to talk to you. Um, if you don't know Colleen, she is the first woman to be named the Archivist of the United States by President Biden in 2023. She's a political scientist who helped lead the White House Historical Association. She worked in the Senate and served as a senior executive at the Library of Congress and its Congressional Research Service. You might know her now as the historian behind In Pursuit, which I just think is such a tremendous, valuable resource for people putting history in context, delving into the lives of great historical figures. And I'm very excited to have you on. We met a couple months ago at at an event for the women's memorial that
Mhm.
you're working on. And I wanted to thank you for coming because I think your career has been really fascinating. You've taken a lot of different turns, and I'm sure you've, had a woman in your life or women in your life who helped you get to where you are. Um, and so I
1,000 for sure, yeah, that's definitely part of the story. So thank you for inviting me and thank you for doing this whole series, which I think is fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fun. It's been interesting to talk to. I've talked to Brooke Baldwin, Ali Vitale,
Mhm.
Lindsay Travinsky, who
Yes.
about, and I've gotten a lot of different kind of responses. Some things that surprised me. I mean, people have talked about grandmothers and mothers, but also like Oprah Winfrey being an
Oh, yeah.
inspiration. It could be anyone. So, on this unique journey for you, where can you talk a little bit about where you grew up, your family kind of structure, and how that helped make you what you are today,
Sure,
who you are today.
absolutely. So I grew up in a town outside of Pittsburgh, so probably about 14, 15 miles east of Pittsburgh. A lot of people know it as Irwin because people travel on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and Irwin is a stop on the Pennsylvania Turnpike if you're headed west. But I actually grew up in the town next to that called North Huntington. But Irwin and North Huntington are really neighboring municipalities, and they all feed into the same high school. Either one is really interchangeable with the other. It was, I would say when I grew up in the 80s and early 90s, it was a working class suburb of Pittsburgh. Now, because it's so close to the city, it is probably increased in wealth because of where it's located. But when I grew up, I would probably put it in, solidly middle class, working class type of neighborhood. And yeah, I grew up, I have a little bit of an unusual family structure in that I just have one sibling, a brother. His name is Greg, and he's an engineer. He's not anywhere near in the history or political science or any of this type of field. But he is 12 years older than me. And so we grew up a little bit independently of each other. We overlapped for 6 years before he left for college, and then never lived full time with us after that because went off to college and was only there in the summers and or only there intermittently from then on, but still was a big influence in my life. And my dad, I've talked about this a lot before. He was also in more the engineering and that type of applied field, but really liked history. And so just was, I think, probably in another life, maybe would have pursued that type of, trajectory. But he liked to tour sites in particular on vacation. So we went, I grew up going to a lot of historical sites near Western Pennsylvania. So was able to be a consultant on the Young Washington film that just came out. And one of the reasons why I was so interested in that film was because a lot of it was set in Western Pennsylvania. And I grew up going to those historic sites, around the Ligonier area, of course, Fort Duquesne, and everywhere, Jumonville Glen. Those were places that you would go as a kid growing up, where I grew up. And my dad was really a big advocate of that. And then my mom was someone who, when I spent a lot of time with her, an activity we did together. My dad and I spent a lot of time together doing sports because I also played a lot of sports growing up, which we can get into later. But and that was certainly influential. But my mom and I spent time reading together. She was a great reader, and she loved to read mystery novels. And so she got me started at a very young age. I inherited her Nancy Drew collection. She had
Yeah.
the early Nancy Drews, not the fancy ones, which I did read, that came later in the 80s and the 90s. Which were like more modern Nancy Drew. Like she was doing, crazy things like, riding around the sports car and all those types of things,
Yeah.
which was a little bit more modern than the original Nancy Drews. But I inherited the original ones and grew up reading those and the Hardy Boys and all, Trixie Belden. And she would read Agatha Christie, and she was a subscriber to Ellery Queen magazine. So she liked to read short story mysteries, and we would have time together in which she would say, now you read your book and I'll read my book. And I think she just wanted, like a little bit of quiet time. But that's really where I developed my love of reading, and also recreational reading. Like reading is something to do that's fun to do, that you don't just have to do, that it's a pastime, it's enjoyable. And still to this day, I try to read recreationally every day, even if it's only for 20 minutes or a half hour. And that's a great habit that I picked up from my mother.
What are you reading now?
Right now, I just started like this new, really cozy mystery novel. It's a lot of things like pop up for me on Kindle or Amazon. And I'm really excited about starting that. I'm only like 1 or 2 chapters in. It's about, I forget the title of it, but it's people that live in these cottages next to each other in Santa Barbara, and then a murder happens in these cottages, and they have to try to figure out, what happened. So I'm really excited about that. I try to read. I mean, I read a lot. I'm a mystery author. I wrote eight mystery novels.
Really?
So, yeah. I wrote 8 mystery novels, so that's a big influence on me. So probably more than 50% of my recreational reading is mysteries, but I do read some literary fiction. I just finished a literary book that came out actually a while ago, 7, 8 years ago. I forget what, Conversations with Friends. And and that was because I went to a bookstore, and it was a featured book at a bookstore. So sometimes it really helps to go to actually in a store and look around. And I saw that as a featured book, and I read the back of it, and I said, I got to read this book. And even though I missed it whenever it came out, and it's like a Hulu series, but it was, every once in a while, I don't read too much literary fiction, but I try to read probably 3 or 4 a year, because it's just a totally different type of writing. Different type of writing than what I do, but I appreciate it. And I think you learn a lot about character development when you read literary fiction.
And also for you, and I find this too, like I loved Big Little Lies, Leanne Moriarty, like very light.
Yes.
But then I just finished Kin, which is a great literary fiction book, but it's just a little bit, it's very thought provoking. Sometimes you just want a break, and those are those mystery novels. And
that's right.
There's always a little like I'm surprised to hear that that's what you read, but I mean that makes total sense.
But I read a lot of history too, alongside it. So right now I'm reading Steve Knott's new book on presidential conspiracy theories. So I'm reading that at Jason. I'm going to do a Substack live with Steve in a few weeks on that book. So I'm reading that in conjunction with my recreational reading. So I always have like 2 or 3 books going at once,
You need a break.
That's right.
Of course, you made history becoming the 11th archivist, the first woman to have that role. Were your parents around for that? I mean, did they get to celebrate you getting that job? And then can you talk a little bit, that was in 2023, and then you, I believe in 2025, left the job. Can you talk a little bit about the path you took to get there? And also, I mean, this is a 2-pronged question, I guess. What is the Archivist of the United States? I think a lot of people don't know what the job is. It sounds
a good question. So my mother passed away about 11 years ago. So she was not with us when that happened, which I'm sad about, because she would have been so excited, I think. But my dad was, but he was older. He was in his late 80s when I became the archivist, 89, I think. So he didn't attend my swearing in ceremony, but we were able to show it to him on C-SPAN. And he was, just, he was like almost beside himself. He almost, not that he didn't understand it, but he was just, I think, so overwhelmed by it. And he lived in a independent senior living facility right in our town where I grew up. And I got a lot of coverage in southwestern Pennsylvania, which was really nice. And I continued to do press in that area. And so I was covered a lot in the news, and the people that there were other residents where he lived would bring him the newspaper, and there I would be, and then I would come in to visit. And so I would talk to people. It was a lot. It was, and talk to them about my job. People were very curious about what I was doing, and that was great. So he did get to see that, which was terrific. He passed away in 2024, actually, when I was the archivist. But he did get to see me become the archivist and see some of those successes, which was terrific. Yeah. And as you mentioned, my tenure was shorter than what I had wanted. I left in 2025. I was fired by President Trump. And, a lot of people ask about that. And I really have to be honest about it, is that people say, well, what happened? Why were you fired? And unfortunately, I really don't have a lot of insight on that, because there has never been any public statement from the White House. There's not been a public statement, certainly from the president, about that. And, even a few months ago, when things concerning presidential records started to get back in the news again because of the Office of Legal Counsel and their memos stating that they did not believe the Presidential Records Act was constitutional, believing that it was unconstitutional. So then that kind of resurrected a number of things. And the Washington Post, I did an extensive interview with the Washington Post, and the reporter there was very good, said, I'm going to go back to the White House and ask them about your termination and ask for a statement on the term. And is that, she didn't say, was it okay, but she just gave me a heads up that she was going to do that. I said, have at it. Like, let me know if you find out. Yeah. This would be actually a really good, a great use of reporting to find out if you're able to discover. And she had no luck, and they declined to comment on that, except the only thing saying that the president reserves the right to, for executive appointments and things like that. The one thing is, of course, the law says that the president must inform Congress for the reasons for such termination for the Archivist of the United States, which has the statute itself, the way it's crafted, is to indicate that the archivist should not be a political appointment. This should be an appointment based upon merit. It should be an appointment based upon, appropriateness or fitness for the office, for qualifications. And so consequently, the other 10 previous archivists, no one had ever been terminated or fired by a president of the United States, even when they crossed over into different presidents than from what they were nominated, or different parties from the presidents from which they were nominated. For example, my predecessor, David Ferriero, was nominated by Obama, served all of the Obama tenure, the first Trump term, and then retired under President Biden. So that would be considered like a normal, or a normal tenure for an archivist of the United States or a librarian of Congress, those types of positions. So no reason was ever provided, as statute requires, to Congress. And a few senators did ask for it when I was fired. By the way, not Democrats, actually Republicans, asking for a reason, and they were not provided with a reason either.
God, how does it, and I won't dwell on this, but when you were fired, is there a direct phone call? How does that work? Because when I talked to Admiral Franchetti, she sort of indicated that it all happened so fast, and it was a minute-long conversation. And I'm curious for you, who was the person directly telling you?
Well, I didn't even know about it, because there had been a little bit of a strange reporting that Marco Rubio was acting as the archivist, which was certainly not true. I was serving as the Archivist of the United States. So we got that cleared up with a news outlet that erroneously reported that. And that was earlier in the week, which was very confusing. But, I went on my way. I had not received, any notification from the White House or anything like that. And it was a Friday evening. It was the same evening uh, in which David Rubenstein actually was relieved of his duties as chair of the Kennedy Center board. And so David was let go earlier in the evening, or like 5 o'clock or something, maybe four. I can't remember. And I saw that come through, and I thought, well, that's really strange. Because as far as I knew, he had a relationship with President Trump and Mrs. Trump. So I thought that was
Yeah.
unusual, not something that was on my radar for something that would happen. And then 2 hours later, then it came down about me. So it was exactly in the same day. And it was tweeted out by, I believe, the Office of Presidential Personnel with a copy to the president. And then so it went out to all of President Trump's supporters and following. And then I looked on my phone, and there was a email from the White House Office of Presidential Personnel with the exact same verbiage that had been tweeted out.
It's interesting because you described the job that you were doing, and in some ways the resident staff, and I've written about them, had a similar job where they're there from
Yes.
one administration to the next. So the chief usher at the White House always was, as you know,
Yes.
nonpartisan. Now this job is seemingly becoming partisan, like everything
Right.
else in Washington. Do you can you do like a brief explanation of what the job
Yes.
is of
Right. Right. Right.
archivist?
So the Archivist of the United States is a really nice title, but I mean, you run the National Archives and Records Administration, which, when I led the agency, was an agency of close to 3,000 people. Probably we probably hovered between 2,800 and 2,900 people who worked at the National Archives, not all in Washington, D.C., although the Washington, D.C. area was the largest concentration of employees. But there were about 40 locations all across the country, either archival facilities, federal records centers, or presidential libraries all across the country that are part of the National Archives and Records Administration. Unfortunately, since I've left, the National Archives has shrunk due to budgetary reductions, and now they have lost 500 employees. So that is a very big decrease in the National Archives. What I will work that out, it's probably about 15%. I would say somewhere hovering 14, 15% of people have left the National Archives, either through the Doge cuts that happened very swiftly, or subsequently through attrition, or we're gonna sunset this provision, this program. And so people were either relocated to other positions, or retired, or phased out. And in other cases, just no hiring behind people that have left. So that is of big concern to me, because when I was at the National Archives, it was difficult to deal with the budget that the archives had at that point in time. It is not as well funded of an agency, for example, as the Library of Congress. And I've made these points all before. And this is only compounding the problem. But the job of the archivist is to lead the agency, and that means leading the agency as far as its overall budget, its priorities, obviously the strategic direction of the agency, what are the priorities that are going to be undertaken. And the mission is the preservation, protection, and sharing of our nation's records, both federal records that are produced in production from our federal agencies, and then, of course, presidential records, which are produced in execution of the Office of the Presidency. Those are the two main types of records at the National Archives and Records Administration. And the archivist is ultimately responsible for the records, for the people, and for the resources of the archives.
Are you concerned about how a President Trump library is going to handle those archives, and how, I think with a lot of presidential libraries, there is a whitewashing that goes on.
Right.
And I guess that would be something that would be of concern to you, knowing the history there.
Well, what I would say is that President Obama's Presidential Center in Chicago, which is, very impressive. I visited when I was the archivist twice when they were building it, and, did hard hat tours and was able to see it because we were going to be a very important partner with the Presidential Center in loaning records and materials to the Obama Presidential Center for display and educational purposes. So I wanted to have a good partnership with them. But, I think that President Trump will probably go that similar direction in that he will build not what we would call a National Archives and Records Administration presidential library, like, for example, the FDR library or the JFK library or, the Jimmy Carter library, the ones that people
Yeah.
maybe have visited previously, but will probably build his own structure that, I don't know if you will call it a presidential library, but it'll be more appropriately likely called a presidential center. The sort of the nomenclature that President Obama and his team adopted. And then, as long as the Presidential Records Act is not declared unconstitutional, which, I don't know, I guess we're going to see what happens with litigation. It's moved through the district court and it's going to move on to the appellate level soon. And it may end up at the Supreme Court. I'm not sure. But as long as the Presidential Records Act continues to be law, then President Trump or President Obama, they do not have their records co-located with them at that facility because it is not a National Archives and Records Administration facility. Those records will remain as President Obama's were in Chicago temporarily, but now they have come to College Park, Maryland, where there is the large archival facility outside of Washington, D.C. And that's where those records will be maintained and preserved. And then he would be able to borrow, or his team would be able to borrow and on loan those records that or objects, artifacts that he might want to display at the Presidential Center, just as the way National Archives is working with the Obama Center.
You've had such an interesting career, and I could talk to you about the archives forever because I think it's so fascinating. But
It is.
It really is. Who in your life, women in particular, because that's the focus here of women in your life who have contributed to your love of history and you're obviously, you see yourself as a steward of American history and you're passionate about it. You mentioned visiting historical sites, but I know that we had been chatting back and forth a little bit about who you were thinking about, because everybody has multiple women. I mean, at first I was thinking this would be the one woman in your life, but it's been interesting to talk to people who say, well, there have been different phases and different people who have mentored me. So was there a history teacher or somebody who really got you jazzed about history and wanting to preserve it?
Yeah. That's a great question. Well, my history teacher was a man. He was great in high school. He was terrific, and he did instill, I would say, my love of history. That's where I really I went to these sites with my dad, and ended up enjoying it a lot of the times when we went. But it wasn't probably until high school when I took an advanced U.S. history class. I was a little bit before the AP ventures, but it was extraordinary for me. It was really eye-opening. And what was really fascinating to me was that there was different interpretations of history. It wasn't just who did what. I mean, you had to learn that, who did what, when, and, you had to have the basic facts down. But after you knew the basic facts of history, that there could be different ways of thinking about history and different ways of interpreting it. And you could argue about that. And that's what I really like doing. But I did have a government teacher. Her name is Pat Corey, and she's my friend on Facebook, and Mrs. Corey. And she was, like I said, not history, but related in government, and took American government when I was a senior. Everybody did in my high school. And that was the first teacher I think that I encountered, or at least a woman who was a teacher who talked about women's rights, who talked about the history of feminism, all these things that I really just knew, I don't know, just a little bit about, but had never certainly been taught. And she provided a whole different perspective, and really was eye-opening to me that, okay, there's this whole world out there. I grew up in, a pretty, as sheltered community here, and there is a whole other world out there where I can really explore all these other topics. There's something interesting about women in government. There's something interesting about women in history. And that just hadn't been a focus, even from my history teacher that I really enjoyed. Previously, that was certainly not something that he focused on. In fact, we had this advanced history book that we read called Perspectives of U.S. History. It's amazing that I could remember the title of this book. And we read all these chapters in this book that had different historical interpretations of like the Jacksonian era and interpretations of the Civil War. So we were exposed to different ways historians were looking at these events in American history. And in that book, there were 2 chapters, African American history and women's history, in this more advanced book, right? Which I think was more suitable for college than high school, but that's why we were using it. And we didn't, those chapters weren't on the reading list.
Really?
No, there were only chapters that weren't. So I mean, and like I said, I really liked my history teacher. So I went up to him after class and I said, why aren't we reading these chapters? And, I guess I was just, I was already, I don't know, causing trouble. I was 15 years old or something. I don't know. And I said, why aren't we reading these chapters? And he said, well, it's not that I don't think they're important. We just don't have time for them because we have to cover all these, we can barely fit in American history. We stop at, we're almost done at World War II. We just run out of time. We don't even get to the Cold War. So he said, but if you want to read them on your own, you should read them. And then if you write something about it, and I will, he had an extra credit program. He said, it'll be an extra credit for you. I said, okay. That sounds fair. He's like, that's a good extra credit assignment for you. So I did. I read the women's history chapter and the African American history chapter, and I wrote like a report on it and why he should teach it in the future. And he said that it was very persuasive. So I felt really good about it. And it was, a very early, I guess, indicator of some things that were going to come. Oh, I think we lost Kate here for a second. We're on live. So what I think I'm going to do is, she had asked me a question. I'm sure she'll be back on. She had asked a question of who had influenced me. Well, I talked a little bit about my government teacher, Pat Corey, but there were certainly other women that influenced me as well. Other women that influenced me when I was in graduate school at Yale. I had the real fortune to interact with a woman named Susan Hockfield, who was the Dean of Graduate Studies at Yale. And she went on to become the first woman